similar to my experience of leaving the water conversation last week. I think I had an expectation that I would experience a bunch of different fire energies and have these really great like insights as the week goes on. And when we arrived here today, that I would have something to report back or to share with all of you, in the realm of my experience of the element of fire. And I don't, and I didn't. And part of me is happy it wasn't fiery and nasty just for the sake of conversation today. But I'm just noticing that it's different. I'm just in flow and I'm just here, and we'll see where today takes us. During the last, 6 months or so, I don't even know if we've been at it that long with the Becoming Gaia conversations, but there was a 7-week conversation I had with Naomi and Deborah and a group of women back in, I think, October or November. And I had these massive insights and different recognitions for myself around my own expression of fire and what it had been up until that point, and this new feeling and this new discovery around fire. And today, as I am gearing into coming into this call and not really like preparing, but just aware the call is happening, the language that's here right now is that my expression of fire is much more subtle. How I show up in my fiery essence is much more subtle. My interpretation when I'm around fire is much more subtle. It's not as explosive and fiery and all-encompassing and damaging and destructive as it once was. It is much more an experience of a slow burn, a warmth, a nourishing element rather than the destructive nature of it. And that's very much what the first 30 plus years of my life were, when fire, when a heated amount of rage or suppression of rage or expression of outrage or intensity were to bubble to the surface of my experience, anybody else who was around would be blasted by fireballs. And it doesn't come like that anymore. It's pliable, it's warm, it's malleable. It creates a softening in my body rather than an explosion to both myself and anybody else who dare be around me. And I always think it's fascinating that a lot of the women in these circles and in my life, not necessarily my daily life, but y'all are in Hawaii. And there's, Pele's but a conversation away from my experience in any given moment, and the fact that there's such an activation and an activity on the islands, and I have such a draw to be there. And so that awareness and that experience when I'm on the islands and when there's people I'm engaging with regularly, that energy, that creation, that reminder is never far from my awareness, and I identify with that a lot. We're coming into a season here in North America, especially in the Rockies and the prairies where I'm at, where one of the things that seems to have shifted in climate is that there obviously is no predictability in any, from season to season. There is the trends that we would once see that were a little bit predictable are no longer. So we're coming into a drought season, and the question always is it going to be a drought or a flooding season? And so we seem to be in these circles of, we mass deforest, the land can no longer hold the moisture the way it once was able to, which in turn transforms it into these dry and fire susceptible areas, just begging for fire to be able to transform the land, activate old seeds within that soil food web, that seed bank, in order to grow specific species that again can grow up and start to harvest water in that hydrological cycle. in one paradigm of the world, those are dangers to be feared. We stopped burning. We stopped our relationship with fire. In fact, I think part of the consequence of colonization was that the way humans, the indigenous peoples, the first peoples of this land related to fire and drought cycles was cut off at its knees, much the same as the cultural, cultural genocide that was inflicted on our first peoples as well. And I think that we're seeing the other side of that, these out of control burns that are happening hotter and faster. And instead of activating these ancient seeds that we know work within that system to bring life post fire, we're seeing fires that are hotter and more devastating than we can even imagine, and perhaps have even seen since the beginning of Gaia. And I'm always fascinated by that. I'm fascinated. I grew up in northern BC, and so one of our spring chores always was burning the grass. And so we'd rake up the leaves and we would burn the grass. I just assumed everybody did that. When I moved to Alberta, I was mocked relentlessly by the people who live here, going, "You don't burn your grass. Like, that would burn the prairies down. You can't do that." And I've been fascinated by these differences in approaches in that seasonal nature here. And as we're coming into that season around here, there's a lot of conversation in many circles that I engage in this physical reality where I live. And it's always, the farmers wanting water. And then the conversation about not enough water. And the conversation seems to die there. There's never a further conversation around patterns of behavior and climate, what monoculture cropping does, for example, to a natural prairie system. And it's like we recognize the impact when there is a fire or no water, but there isn't enough curiosity to really pull up that soil or that fodder underneath and have a real deeper sense of that. And I think it's one of the ways that in this mainstream culture, we can kind of skim over. We have to touch something really intimate, like our impact, when we do that. And so, just there's all of these random places where I consider fire where I didn't before. So it's not just about my rage and my outrage like it was 10 years ago. It isn't about that explosive nature for me anymore. I play with it in the elements of what I see outside of my eyes as it's connected to Gaia and her rhythms and cycles, and where fire plays a role in that. So I'm curious if we tended to and cultivated and listened for those cues, if our fire, if that which emerges from us rather than spewing out of us, if the transformation that can happen when I engage that fire inside of myself in a mindful and intentional way, what could be possible on the other end of that, rather than waiting till it gets so dead and so dried out and so old and so neglected that it just lights on fire and creates a different beast of its own. Yeah. So I don't have anything else to add other than I have this blankness around the fact that I expected there to be some recognizable fire responses in my week, and there wasn't in the ways I've known it. So I'm going to leave that curiosity hang there. And as all of you check in, I'm sure that as I listen, I will hear it in a different way. So thank you for joining today. And I'll look